Okay, there you
go. My name is Don Wicks, and I'll be interviewing you today, and we'll talk about your life for when you're a young man, and more specifically, once you've joined the service and your time in the service, maybe a little bit of time while you're overseas, and what you experienced over there, and then we'll go to after you've got out of the service, kind of what did you do and what did you learn while you were in the service, and you can talk about your buddies, etc. If there's anything you can think of. So if you would you start back and introduce yourself and start back where you want to start, and let me hear what you have to say.
Start at the very beginning. Okay. All right. Well, my name is William Rager Wright. My middle name is Rager. As I'll mention, I was born in Ragersville, Ohio, named after my great-great-grandfather. During the summer of 1930, my father and mother and five of my siblings were living in California. My dad was operating a stationery store. This was right at the beginning of the Depression, and the stationery store went bankrupt, and my dad gathered his family together in a Model T Ford with his 5 children and headed eastward to Ohio on, as I was told, washboard roads, and flat tires were innumerable. A lot of excitement, as they didn't have motels back then. They camped out along the way. We got to Ragersville after having gone up the last hill in Ragersville backward. The Model T wouldn't make it up forward because of the gear ratio. With all of the family in this Model T Ford, they couldn't make it up the hill. So my oldest brother, who was driving, told me that he turned the car around and went up in reverse because it had a lower gear ratio, and made it up the hill that way. We stayed with my grandma Wright home there called the Good House in Ragersville, Ohio. It was actually a restaurant, but had several rooms to rent upstairs. And there was a small store and a kitchen on the main floor. I was born in room number 1 of this Good House, which was located at the top of the stairs. The attending doctor was George Weiss, and in those days it was probably the most miserable winter on record, cold and damp. We were poverty-stricken, really, and the ones that really helped us out in those days were completely unknown to us. I've been told the story many times that the Amish people would come by and leave butter and cheese and eggs and potatoes and milk on our doorstep. They would come sometime in the early morning, and we never knew, and they would leave this food for us. I remember that winter Christmas gifts were like a lump of coal wrapped up in tissue paper. One aunt of mine, Auntie Cat, we called her, would come from the theater that they operated with little treats that they would give out for New Year's. So this was my entry into life, sort of into a poverty-stricken time and what we called back then the Depression years. I was told that the family later moved to New Philadelphia, Ohio, which is about 12 miles from Ragersville. We moved into an apartment on the second floor of a place. The store's name was Kalamazoo, and I can still remember, I think I can remember seeing the flashing neon sign saying, Kalamazoo, direct to you. And my father, who was an attorney of all things, went to work with the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District, where he remained until he took ill and passed away from cancer. My mother died when I was 8 years old, and we were living in New Philadelphia, and the home is still standing. I've been back to see it several times. I have a few memories of this house, but I am told that this is where I fell off the roof of a detached garage and landed, of all things, on a milk bottle, which resulted in a nice scar. If you looked, you can see a nice scar still remaining on my forehead. Another memory of this house on North Broadway Street in New Philadelphia was that we had a cherry tree, which I enjoyed too much on one occasion. Apparently I ate so many of the cherries that I had to be taken to a doctor and actually have my stomach pumped. And it was in this house that I have the most pleasant memories of my mother. As I mentioned, she died when I was 8. They put her on a stretcher and moved her from upstairs bedroom out into the hearse to take her to the hospital, not the hearse, the ambulance to take her to the hospital. She held my hand and squeezed it as she was going out the door, and I'll never forget the words she said, "Be a good boy, Billy." Those were the last words I heard from my mother. She died shortly after in the hospital. I also remember the funeral somewhat, especially the ride to East Liverpool, Ohio, which is where her family was from, in a big stretch limousine, my first experience in a limousine. My mother was first buried in East Liverpool, but then after my father's death in 1950, my mother's casket was moved from East Liverpool to New Philadelphia into a gravesite along with my father. Let's see. I was 11 years old when World War II broke out, and it seemed like half of the town of New Philadelphia left immediately into the service. My two brothers, older brothers, David and Nathan, both entered soon after. I also recall going to the Stage Door Canteen located in Denison Train Depot. This was about 8 miles from New Philadelphia. And I would go down there with my sister, my oldest sister, Margaretha, and we would work for the Salvation Army. They were moving troops back and forth between Chicago and New York, and Denison was on the main line. Denison was also a stopover for the old Puffin Billies to get coal and water. And in the meantime, the GIs were, they would open their windows to the train. They wouldn't allow them off the train. And so we would, a bunch of volunteers would run out with sandwiches and donuts and coffee and soft drinks for the soldiers as they were waiting for their water and coal. It was a favorite spot, and I thoroughly enjoyed seeing these huge engines. And to this day, I have a love for trains and thoroughly enjoy riding them and seeing them, and sad to see that the old passenger trains are not as available as they were back then. I attended junior high there in New Philadelphia. I remember a lot of fun things happening in the neighborhood. We were close to a park, and I spent a lot of time there. In the summer, we would swim, and in the winter, we would ice skate on the pond. I was a big kid, but I did not participate in sports. I wanted to, but my dad disagreed. He raised all six of us without a mother, and turned out to be a very good cook, but he was very insistent that I be there at mealtime, and I couldn't do that if I wanted to participate in sports. During the summer of 1946, my oldest sister, who, like I mentioned, was involved with the Salvation Army, took me with her to the Salvation Army camp in Willoughby, which is actually Mentor-on-the-Lake, Ohio, near Cleveland, where I worked as a counselor with disadvantaged kids. I finally did graduate from New Philadelphia High School in 1948. All six of us graduated from New Philadelphia High School. From my diary, from my dad's diary, I'm quoting, quote, "On Thursday, July the 8th, 1948, Billy left unannounced," in other words, I ran away, "to Richland, Washington. On Tuesday, July the 13th, I received a collect message from Western Union saying, quote, 'Arrived safely, had a nice trip, Bill.' In October of that year, my dad sent money for my return. I traveled on the Great Northern Empire Builder to Chicago, and then the Pennsylvania Railroad to Canton, and then by bus to New Philadelphia. My dad's entry on November the 2nd says that I started to work for the Rural Electrification Agency, that's REA, clearing right-of-way for a power line in Coshocton, Ohio, Coshocton County, Ohio. During the summer of 1949, I was invited to work with my cousin, Wilbur Scott, in Bloom, Kansas, of all places, and to go through a wheat harvest. I think this was a way for my dad to keep me out of trouble. And I left for Bloom, Kansas in June and spent the summer. I stayed with my Aunt Annie Scott's son, Wilbur, and his wife, Betty, in Bloom, Kansas. They farmed a 5,000-acre dry farm in wheat. I remember this year being a bumper crop, as they called it, of wheat selling for $2 a bushel. My job was driving a truck. I drove alongside a combine, a huge combine, until the truck was full, and then drove off to the grain elevator. We had lunches at a restaurant there in Bloom, and they had a hot roast beef sandwich with mashed potatoes and gravy, which was extremely good. One week, we loaded all of our equipment up and traveled to Lamar, Colorado, to help Annie's daughter, Jo Swenson, and her husband, John, in their wheat harvest. And I worked hard that summer, thinking back on it, but I really enjoyed it. I got back to New Philadelphia, and in September of 1949, a buddy of mine, Jack, or we called him Blink because he was always blinking, Blink Davis, and I decided to join the Army. Begrudgingly, my father gave permission for me to join. September the 9th, 1949, both Blink and I did our basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky with the 3rd Armored Division. After basic training, I was selected as cadre, or a drill instructor, and I remained there at Fort Knox. Blink was sent to Germany, and he was angry with me because I got the Cush job and he got transferred to Germany. Then in October 1950, I was transferred to Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky, with the 101st Airborne Division. And we opened this camp for recruit training. And it was here at Camp Breckenridge that I received my orders to go to Korea. And I mean directly to Korea. Do not stop, do not pass go directly to Korea. I reported first to Camp Stoneman, which is in Oakland, California, where I boarded the USS Breckenridge and joined about 7,000 other troops on this 11-day trip. I was seasick the entire trip and arrived in Japan in July 1951. We processed through Camp Drake in Japan, which is near Tokyo, to prepare to go directly to the front lines. And we traveled by train to Sasebo, Japan, which is on the southern tip of Japan. We traveled through Hiroshima and Nagasaki along the way and saw the residuals of those atomic bombs to those two cities. In Sasebo, we rode a ferry boat at night from Sasebo to Busan, Korea. And then we rode by train to Yeongdong-po, where I joined the 1st Cavalry Division on the front lines. On the train trip up to Yeongdong-po, we were constantly being shot at with small arms fire. So we spent a lot of time on the floor. At Yeongdong-po, we were on the offensive, taking hills one at a time, pushing the Chinese and North Koreans back into North Korea. On Thanksgiving morning of 1951, I woke up with a fever and was literally unable to move my hands or legs and unable to function. I was able to call for a medic who eventually came and put me on a litter jeep and transported me to a MASH hospital. During this trip, I lost consciousness, and I do not recall anything for the next 4 days when I woke up in Tokyo Army General Hospital. I was diagnosed with hemorrhagic fever, which is a highly fatal disease. I was a patient at this hospital for about 6 months, and then I was reassigned directly to the hospital. The doctors wanted to keep their eye on me to see if there were any residuals from this horrible disease, again called hemorrhagic fever. I was a patient there, as I mentioned, for 6 months, and then assigned to the hospital for the remainder of my service. Upon discharge from Fort Lewis on January the 9th, 1953, I went cross-state and lived with my brother Wakefield. I called him Wakey, Wright, in Richland. Wakey was one of the original members of the Manhattan program, and was recruited from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where he worked in a munitions plant, to come to Hanford or Richland. On March the 14th, 1953, I'll never forget that date, I went to the Washington State Patrol Office within a half a mile of where I am currently sitting to get a Washington driver's license, since my Ohio driver's license, of course, had expired, and it was only good for 90 days after discharge. I stood in line for quite a while at this State Patrol office. Finally got up to the guy at the counter, and whose name, by the way, was George Bellman. And I just happened to comment to him. I said, "It looks like you need some help." He was there all by himself with all these other people. And he looked up at me and said, "Well, if you're interested in the State Patrol, go back and talk to the sergeant." I pulled myself out of line and went back and talked to John Caldwell, who was the sergeant in charge there. He interviewed me for maybe at the most 5 minutes and said he would let me know. That same afternoon, he called me at my brother's house and asked me when I could come to work. And I said, "Tomorrow." So I literally did go to work for the State Patrol the next day without a Washington driver's license, I might mention. Try to do that today, you know. And I continued to work there at the State Patrol office here in Kennewick, and but then I was transferred to the Ellensburg office after I got married, which I'll mention a little later. While in Ellensburg, I was issuing driver's licenses and operating the State Patrol radio, and I took the Dean of Students at Central Washington University, then it was called the College of Education, on a driver's test. In the course of the conversation, he asked me if I was attending Central Washington College of Education, and I answered no. And he said, "Why not?" And when he found out that I was a veteran, he made arrangements for me to apply for the GI Bill of Rights, which I received, and which ultimately paid for my next 4 years of education. 2 years at Central Washington and 2 years at the University of Washington in Seattle. I finished all my necessary credits at the University of Washington in December 1958, continuing to work nights and evenings with the State Patrol. I participated in the commencement at the University of Washington on June the 13th, 1959. In July of 1959, I was accepted to the next State Patrol Academy in Shelton to become a commissioned officer with the Washington State Patrol. My first assignment with the Washington State Patrol was as a line trooper. We were not called troopers back then. We were just called State Patrol officers. We wore a conventional hat with a bill on the front with a large emblem on the top of the hat. And it was several years later that the patrol went to the current Smokey the Bear hat. Served on the Seattle-Tacoma Highway for just a little bit over a year when I was transferred into headquarters with the State Patrol as the assistant to the personnel director of the State Patrol. I might mention that my degree from the University of Washington was in personnel management. While I was with the State Patrol, I also, in headquarters, was responsible for recruiting and testing new recruits. A job opportunity came up with the Department of Personnel, which was right next door to the State Patrol office in the General Administration Building in Olympia. And it was an opportunity I literally could not turn down, not only because of the money, but also because of the professional growth potential with the Department of Personnel. And so I left behind my career with the Washington State Patrol and went to work for the Department of Personnel, where I continued to work for the next 20 years until I retired in 1983. Upon retirement from the Department of Personnel, I relocated to Yakima to be closer to my family. And shortly after I relocated, I went to work as a vocational rehabilitation specialist, and primarily working with injured workers, and until my retirement. And then 5 years ago, I relocated from Yakima to Kennewick, again, to be closer to my family. And that's pretty much my story.
Well, very good. During your time in your service, what was your highest rank you held?
Corporal.
Corporal.
Corporal. Yeah, I spent too much time in the hospital.
That's probably the 44th Med you went to.
Oh, really?
I remember because I was the 1st Cav Division and I had to go to the hospital.
I'll be darned.
It's not too far from Yonge-on-Po. I think it was 44th Med.
Oh.
Nash Hospital, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of your buddies you may have had while you were in the service?
That's really strange. I just don't. I don't keep in contact with anybody associated to my military career. It's kind of, like I say, a lot of them died. And Some of the best buddies that I had, that I chummed around with, they literally were all killed in action. And so, no, I don't have any right now.
Yeah, I was stationed in the 1st Cav Division also, and was on the DMZ. And yeah, I can see where during a combat that a lot of the people come and they go,
Yeah.
they die or they get transferred, and you don't really get to meet a lot of
No.
people very closely anyway.
Yeah.
For my time there, which is after the Korean War, I don't remember, but a couple buddies.
Yeah,
In
interesting.
fact, one of them contacted me last week from New Jersey.
Wow.
And last time I saw him was in 1959. So,
Wow.
but yeah. So during your time in service, did from the time you were a high school kid and you joined the service, did you learn anything or grow up, or did it change your way of thinking, or what did it do for you?
Well, yes, that's a good term. I grew up, literally, and you learn to take care of yourself. Of course, I had pretty much learned that without a mother. You don't realize how much you miss a mother until you don't have a mother. And so I was raised in that kind of an environment, so I was pretty independent there as I was growing up. But the military taught me a lot. It taught me discipline. It taught me the whole concept of getting along with your friends or relations or whatever. Sometimes some of your quote buddies were less than what you would really hope to pick for a friend, but you became very, very close to these people when you're working side by side with them. And
yeah, I find that during the service you learned how to work with other people.
That's right.
Of all types. You've got some that aren't so good,
Yep.
some that are very good, and some that are mediocre, but you're able to work with them all.
that's right.
And it helps you out when you get to be a
So-
civilian again, and it shows up in your work.
Yeah, very definitely.
Well, I've got nothing more. I enjoyed your interview, and I'm sure whoever else sees this thing will enjoy it. Do you have anything else you want to say?
No, it's an honor to have this opportunity. It really is. And I've always told my kids and my grandkids over the years that my military career was very interesting. I served, this is the way I tell them, I said, I served in the 3rd Armored Division and never rode in a tank. I served in the 101st Airborne Division and never jumped out of an airplane. And I served in the 1st Cavalry Division and never rode a horse. So
Yeah.
my kids,
That's about the way he is, too.
my kids and grandkids always got a kick out of that.
Okay, well, I appreciate you coming by, and
Thank you.
thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.